Today we're going to answer the question, what is an argument? According to the Monty Python sketch, an argument is a connected series of statements intended to establish a proposition. It isn't just saying no it isn't, or yes it is. In logic, instead of saying that it's a connected series of statements, we would say that an argument has several premises and a conclusion. So an argument consists of a series of premises and a conclusion. The person defending that argument claims that the premises are true and that the conclusion is true or likely to be true, and that it follows from the premises. The structure should be as clear as possible, with no hidden assumptions, so that the argument can be understood and evaluated. There are different types of arguments. In this class, we are going to talk about deductive arguments first, and then inductive arguments, analogy, abductive arguments, and reductio ad absurdum. Now let's start with deductive arguments. Deductive arguments go from general to specific, and in a deductive argument, if your premises are true and the argument is valid, then the conclusion must be true. An example would be, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. And there is Socrates. Here's another example of a valid deductive argument. If it is raining, then the grass is wet. It is raining, therefore, conclusion, the grass is wet. This is a good argument, and if it's raining, it's going to be true. Now here's another version of this. If it's raining, then the grass is wet. The grass is what? Wet. Therefore, it's raining. This doesn't follow. This argument's not valid because the grass could be wet for a number of other reasons, and it's not raining. You could be using your sprinkler or something. This type of argument, so the one on the left, is called the modus ponens. So you have a P, therefore Q. You affirm P, therefore you have Q. Now the other argument, that is the invalid argument, is the other way around. So you have P, therefore Q, and then you affirm Q and you get P. You can't get that. So these are examples of valid and invalid arguments. All right, let me keep going with another example. Now we have, it's raining, therefore the grass is wet, the same thing, but then the grass is not wet, therefore it's not raining. This is a good argument. Now on the other hand, if it's raining, the grass is wet, it's not raining, therefore the grass is not wet, is not a good argument for the same reasons as the slide before. This one is called a modus tollens. So the structure of this argument is P therefore Q, and then you deny Q and you deny P. The little sign means negative. And so if it's raining, don't go outside. Very important distinction to make is the distinction between validity and truth. Validity refers to the structure of the argument, while truth refers to the truth value of the premises and the conclusion. So the modus ponens that we saw before, which was P, therefore Q, you affirm P, and then you conclude Q, that is the structure of the argument, but you can pick up a structure like this and you can plug in sentences that are not true. So for instance, if it's raining, then the grass will electrocute you. It's raining, therefore the grass will electrocute you. This argument is valid, but is not true because the grass will not electrocute you. So it's an important distinction to make. So the most important thing to note about deductive arguments is that in a deductive argument, if your premises are true and the structure of the argument is valid, therefore your conclusion must be true. You're guaranteed to have a true conclusion. If the conclusion of an argument, of deductive argument, is false, then either the argument is invalid, the structure is invalid, or at least one of your premises is false, or maybe all of your premises are false, or both the premises are false and the structure is invalid. What I've been trying to illustrate so far is that in deductive arguments, truth and validity are two completely different things. Let's move on to inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are the opposite of deductive arguments. Inductive arguments go in the opposite direction. So you go from particular instances to a generalized claim. The truth of the claim is not guaranteed by the examples, but it is reached via the examples or the instances. So for instance, if you have a dog and you notice that the dog wags its tail when they're doing something fun, and you have seen this multiple times, and so you conclude that the dog always wags its tail when they're having fun, when they're happy. So this is an example of an inductive argument. Analogy is another type of argument. Arguments from analogy are a special case of inductive arguments. In arguments from analogy, perceived similarities are understood to infer some further similarities that have not been observed yet. A good argument from analogy needs to have three strong factors: relevance, degree of similarity, and amount and variety of examples. A false analogy is when we draw an analogy that does not have enough similarities in the aspects listed above. So as when we can say we compare apples with oranges. Abductive arguments are used very frequently in philosophy. It has nothing to do with kidnapping. It's just a weird name. Anyway, abductive arguments are when we reach a conclusion based on an explanation that best explains a certain situation. It's also called inference to the best explanation. An example of this would be Sherlock Holmes, when he says, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is the truth. Finally, the last type of argument we're going to talk about is reductio ad absurdum. This is a very important type of argument in philosophy. Reductio ad absurdum means reduction to absurdity. It is a form of argument that attempts to refute a statement by showing that it leads to consequences that are ridiculous, absurd, or impossible. Related to the reductio ad absurdum is the principle of non-contradiction. The idea that something cannot be true and false at the same time. You cannot have P and not P. If you can show how a set of premises implies P and not P, you will have created a reductio ad absurdum argument. Here's a famous example of a reductio ad absurdum type of argument by Galileo. Galileo reasoned that it does not make sense to say that a lighter object will fall slower than a heavier object. If this was true, if we tie a lighter object to a heavier object, the lighter object would fall slower and it would drag the heavier object and slow it down. But since both together are heavier, they would fall faster. Therefore, they would fall faster and they would fall slower at the same time. Conclusion: it does not make sense to say that a lighter object falls slower than a heavier object. So here's a little graphic to help you visualize what we learned in class. So we have two different kinds of arguments, deductive arguments and non-deductive arguments. We talked about inductive arguments, analogy, abductive arguments, and reductio ad absurdum. Now let's look at the deductive arguments. They can be valid or invalid. A valid argument, deductive argument with true premises is a good argument. An invalid argument is a bad argument, and then a valid argument with false premises is a bad argument. On the non-deductive side, you can have either strong or weak arguments. So strong arguments with true premises are good arguments. Strong arguments with false premises are bad arguments, and weak arguments are bad arguments. That's it for this class. Next time we'll talk about fallacies. Bye.